Testing, 1, 2, 3. All right. Looks like we've got just about everyone. Good turnout. Welcome, everyone. I assume you're all here to learn about PowerCLI. So we're going to talk about PowerCLI. Standard disclaimer. Fascinating, I know. My name is Brian Watrous. A brief little background about me. I'm a VMware employee. This is my 19th year. And during my many years at VMware, I've always been very interested in all the different automation technologies that we provide. So I've messed around with PowerCLI, I've messed around with Orchestrator, I've messed around with VCF automation and other technologies that have come and gone. But today we're going to talk about PowerCLI. Our agenda is pretty quick and to the point. So in the first section, we're going to simply talk about automation in the vSphere world in general fairly quickly, and how PowerCLI relates to that. Then in the second section, we're going to talk about what are known as cmdlets. If you're familiar with PowerShell, you're already familiar with cmdlets. In the third section, we're going to talk about several important concepts to understand from the PowerShell world. Then in the fourth section, I'll give you an actual example script that shows you essentially the basic structure that you will need whenever you do anything in PowerCLI. And then finally, I'll point you to some helpful resources. I noticed a bunch of phones popping up there a moment ago. Looks like you're scanning the QR code. The QR code there will take you to a series of videos that I've been building about PowerCLI. So if what I talk about today stirs up your interest and you want to learn more, that's one place you can go to learn. If you haven't gotten that QR code, I'll put it back up on the screen in a moment. But I've got only a limited amount of time. So let's look at the first section here. Let's talk about automation in the world of vSphere in general and how PowerCLI relates to it. Now, there's the QR code if you missed it before. You've all presumably worked with vCenter and the vSphere client. You've logged into the vSphere client. You've done things like power on a virtual machine or create a virtual machine or create a cluster, put a host into maintenance mode. All those types of tasks that you've been performing using the vSphere client, you can perform using our automation technologies, such as PowerCLI, or perhaps you want to use Orchestrator. This is a slight fib here, but they're all going through the same API, and therefore you can do with one tool essentially the same things you can do with all the others. So whether you're using the vSphere client or PowerCLI, you're going to be able to go through the vCenter Server's API to do things with virtual machines and hosts and clusters and data stores and a whole lot more. Now, why would you automate? Well, you all know the answer to this. There's two primary benefits to automation in any world. The speed benefits that you get and the reliability of doing things in a consistent, predictable manner every single time. So no different here with PowerCLI. We're going to speed up your daily mundane operations that can be automated, and you're going to be running them from scripts or something like that so that they're performed identically every single time, and things become much more predictable. Now, throughout this session, as I talk about PowerCLI, I'm going to be focusing on just one sliver of what you can do with PowerCLI. One sliver of PowerCLI's capabilities are focused on doing things in your vSphere environment. But as you can see from this extensive, though not complete list, you can use PowerCLI to automate lots of other technologies, such as the ones that you see there. So vSAN, NSXSG, and so forth. But let's focus on vSphere as our example, since we all know vSphere. Now, PowerCLI is built on top of Microsoft PowerShell. So many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with PowerShell and the notion of cmdlets. In PowerShell, cmdlets are little commands that you can run to do things. And in general, the way this is going to work is you're going to specify a commandlet. For example, one of the PowerCLI commandlets is called git-vm host. That will look up one or more ESXi servers in your environment. So the various commandlets, whether we're talking about generic PowerShell commandlets or the PowerCLI commandlets, are in general going to follow this format, where it's a verb dash noun for the name of every single PowerCLI commandlet that you use. Some examples. There is a commandlet that we provide in PowerCLI called git-vm. And as its name suggests, you can use that commandlet to look up one or more virtual machines. So if you do git-vm, we'll return information about VMs. If you do new-vm, that's the commandlet that you use to deploy new virtual machines. Set-vm allows you to change characteristics of VMs. For example, maybe you want to change the number of CPUs or the amount of memory. Move-vm allows you to do things like vMotion migrations. And what do you suppose remove-vm would do? Use that one carefully. All right, so that's some background. But let's talk about some commandlets from PowerCLI and see how we use these. Our first example here is a commandlet called install-module. That commandlet, followed by -name VMware.PowerCLI, will install PowerCLI. So if you have PowerShell but you don't have PowerCLI, that's all it takes to get it installed. There are other ways of installing PowerCLI. If you are air-gapped and you want to know how to do that in an air-gapped environment, talk to me offline. But if you've got PowerShell and a connection to the internet, that's all it's going to take to get PowerCLI installed. So now that you've got PowerCLI installed, in order for PowerCLI to do something to those virtual machines or hosts or data stores, you're first going to have to connect PowerCLI to your vCenter server or an ESXi server. We'll use vCenter as our example. So to do that, we'll do connect-vi server, followed by the IP address or FQDN of your vCenter server, followed by -user and -password to supply your credentials. Now, hopefully, most of you right now are groaning inwardly, seeing that password in clear text. Don't worry, we'll take care of that clear text password in a moment. But this is the basics of making a connection from PowerCLI to your vCenter server. Just connect-vi server, a few arguments, and boom, you're connected. Now, again, at the tail end there, I can see a clear text password, and that's bad. Let's get rid of that. PowerShell provides a commandlet called git-credential. It will pop up a window like this, where you can securely type your username and password without anybody looking over your shoulder and seeing the password. So in this example here, I'm using git-credential to pop up that window, get the credentials, and you'll notice looking at that command that I'm actually storing the results in a variable called $vcreds. So I can use that later on to actually make the connection. So now that we've got our credentials stored in the $vcred variable, we can go back and do the connect-vi server commandlet, but in a more secure fashion this time. So notice this time with the connect-vi server commandlet, we're still going to have to specify the IP address or the FQDN of our vCenter server, but no more -user, no more -password. Instead, we simply say -credential, followed by the variable that we stored our credentials in. Once you've connected to your vCenter server, PowerCLI commandlets can do all sorts of exciting things. For example, git-vm will return information about every single virtual machine that your vCenter server knows about. So in my massive lab environment here, you can see that there are 7 virtual machines, big environment, almost as big as yours. Now, notice for those 7 virtual machines, by default, git-vm is reporting 4 properties for each of those virtual machines: the name, the power state, how many CPUs, and how much memory. Those are just 4 properties. There's actually more hidden behind the scenes. I'll show you how to look them up in use those too. But even this alone is giving us some useful info. But we can do more. You can use that same git-vm, passing in arguments to indicate a specific VM that you're interested in. Or you could use a wildcard if you wanted to do that. But -name followed by the name of a VM will look up that one VM. Now, -name is a parameter that oftentimes can be omitted. For example, if you do the next command, it's going to do essentially the same thing. If you don't say -name, you just say a VM name, it's going to assume that that's a VM name. So you have some flexibility in PowerCLI in terms of exactly how you specify what you're interested in. Start -VM. What does that do? That'll power on a virtual machine. Simple one-liner. You got your VM up and running. Or on the next slide, again, you can see the move -VM command that we just saw briefly a moment ago. So if you get a VM and pipe that through move -VM and supply the name of an ESXi server, we will vMotion migrate that virtual machine from the host it's on to whichever host you specify. And we'll give you the lovely progress bar to let you see the progress as we do so. Now, that same git-vm commandlet can do all sorts of different types of moves. We just saw how to do a vMotion migration. That same commandlet, if the VM's powered off, would do a cold migration. Or if you want to, you can do a storage vMotion to move the VM from one data store to another. Or maybe you want to move the virtual machine from one VM folder to another. There are lots of different types that you can do using the one commandlet called move-vm. Right, that's a quick introduction to some of the things you can do with some of our commandlets. But I'd like to take a step back for a moment and talk about some important concepts from PowerShell. In PowerShell, you can select properties of the objects that you're retrieving. If you know the names of the properties, it's easy to get just those properties. You simply say git-vm or git-vm host or git-data store, and then pipe that through the select commandlet. After the select commandlet, you specify the names of the properties you want, and boom, that's what you get. So whereas before git-vm was returning 4 properties, with this example, maybe I'm just interested in the name of the VMs. So important concept 1 in PowerShell, learn to use select. Second concept from PowerShell that you're going to want to know how to do is, this is actually the same thing. This is just showing you additional parameters, additional properties that we're looking up. But the second thing is what's known as where, or where-object. Again, that's a PowerCLI commandlet that allows you to filter the results. In this particular example, once again, we're doing a git-vm to get all the VMs, but by piping through where and then using the PowerShell notation, we can say things like, I only want to see the virtual machines that have more than 4 gigabytes of memory. A third and crucially important concept in PowerShell is how to look up properties and methods of objects. And that's what this git member commandlet does. If you have an object and you want to know what properties it has or what methods it has, you can just pipe the object to git-member, again, a PowerShell commandlet, and it will provide you a detailed list of all the methods and all the properties of that object. So just picking a few randomly here, actually I can't see that there, so power state is a property we could say we want to look up, or we could look up the amount of disk space in a VM, or we could look up what host the VM's on. Git-member opens up a world of possibilities. It lets you look underneath the covers in the object to see what's in there. Yes, sir.
So I would run a git member, I would get all those properties, then I can use select to basically get.
So the question is, if he uses git-member and finds all these property names, could he go back a slide or two and use those to select just those properties? That's exactly what you can do. All right, continuing onwards here. Those are 3 PowerShell concepts. There are a whole bunch more you should learn. If you want to know how to do PowerCLI, you should brush up on PowerShell. So take a class, watch some videos, read a tutorial, learn about PowerShell. But those are 3 things that you need to know. But wait, and bonus, 4th thing. Like every programming language, PowerShell has variables, and they come in real handy for us in PowerCLI. For example, if I do a git-vm on some virtual machine, chances are I'm going to want to continue to refer back to that same virtual machine. I want to look up this property now, and then that property later. I want to run this method now, and some other method later on. I don't want to have to keep doing git-vm every time I want to do something. So by doing git-vm or git-vm host or git-data store, if you'll assign the value of that commandlet to a variable, like we're doing here, then you can use that variable later on to say things like $vm.property_name is another way you can make use of those properties that you saw from git-member. So for example here, we're looking up a specific VM, storing that VM in a variable called $vm, and we just saw from git-member that one of the properties of a virtual machine is called VM host. That points to the host that the virtual machine is running on. So when we run this, all this information that you see in this table here is information about the host that that virtual machine is on. But you wouldn't know how to do this if you didn't know the name of the property. Continuing onwards here, let's start putting these pieces together by looking at an example script. So here's the first 11 lines. These are pretty generic. I'm not even going to tell you what this script is doing just yet, because these are the same things that you're probably going to do in any sort of PowerCLI script. In lines 1 through 3, we're testing to see, is PowerCLI installed? If PowerCLI is not installed, what are we going to do? Line 3 says install PowerCLI. You already know how to do line 3. In lines 6 and 7, we're using that git-credential commandlet provided by PowerShell to securely get the credentials. We're storing those credentials in a variable called $vcreds, and you know how we're going to use those a few lines from here. In line number 10, we set up another variable. Maybe I'm tired of typing sa-vc sa-01.vclass.local. So I'll just store that fqdn in a variable and can use it throughout the rest of the script. But crucially, in line number 11, what commandlet are we running? Connect-vi server, the same one we started with. Passing in the credentials, and at this point, our script is connected to our vCenter server. That's pretty generic. So now that we talked about the generic stuff, I should probably tell you what this actual example is designed to do. What this script is going to do is to go look at all of our virtual machines, find all the virtual machines that have snapshots, and determine how old each snapshot is. Why are you laughing?
I have this script running.
Yeah.
Every week in my...
Raise your hand if in your environment you run into issues with users in their snapshots. So, that's why I picked this example. Anyways, now that you know what the script is going to do, let's see how it does it. In lines 12 and 13, we're getting the current date. Why are we doing that? Well, because later on I'm going to do a calculation that says, let's see what the difference is between the date that the snapshot was created versus right now. In lines 15 and 16, we're using git-vm to get all of our VMs, not just one, but all the VMs are in that variable called $vms. And then in lines 18 and 19, I'm setting up a variable that's going to come in handy in just a few moments. Let me keep it mysterious for the moment, though. So here's where this script does what makes this script unique. In line number 21, we start a loop. In that loop, each time we go through loop iteration, we're going to take one of the VMs from the VMs variable, and we're going to stuff that into another variable called $vm. So each time we go through the loop, $vm is a different VM. Then in lines 25 and 26, I am using some admittedly overly complicated code here involving something called extension data. I could have written the same code simply using git-snapshot to look up information, but one of the things I wanted to slip in this discussion is to introduce you to extension.data. Don't have time to go into all the details about it, but extension.data opens up a world of possibilities. So lines 22 and 23 are finding VMs that have snapshots. If the current VM doesn't have a snapshot, skip it. Lines 25 and 26 are finding out the date and time that the current VM snapshot was created, so that in lines 28 and 29, we can do some basic arithmetic to figure out how old each snapshot is. And then the code that you see in lines 31 through 36 is updating that variable I showed you a few moments ago called $VM details. All that is a variable that's going to hold an object for each virtual machine that has a snapshot. And that object's going to tell us what the name of the VM is, when its snapshot was created, and how old the snapshot is. Lines 38 and 39 are just going to dump out what we found. And then, as a matter of best practice, when your script is done, you should disconnect from the vCenter server. So if you actually run this script, so I called mine get snaps. If you run this script, notice down on the bottom, we've got a table that reports to us. In my massive lab environment, I have 4 virtual machines that have snapshots. And I can see clearly here when each snapshot was created, how old each snapshot is, what the name of each virtual machine is. And if you don't like the order, you could change using select and properties. You can format this table however you want. So that's a single example of how you could use the techniques that we've been talking about. Since we're talking about snapshots, again, you could use get that snapshot instead of that more complicated way I was doing it. But there's also new dash snapshot to create new snapshots, and remove snapshot, and other cmdlets useful to deal with those pesky snapshots. Now I have a few more minutes here. What I'd like to close on is pointing you to some resources that you need to know to continue onwards in your PowerCLI journey. One of those resources, I gave you the QR code before, videos on PowerCLI. But here are some others. Microsoft PowerShell has a cmdlet called get-help. You need to learn how to use get-help. It's pretty simple. You say get-help, followed by a cmdlet, get-vm, get-vm host, get-data store. Just get-help, followed by the name of the cmdlet, and it will tell you about that cmdlet. It'll tell you the name of the cmdlet. The synopsis section will give you a very brief description of what that cmdlet does. I'll talk in a few moments about the syntax section. Let's ignore it for right now. The description section gives you a more detailed description of what this particular cmdlet does. Related links section will tell you other related cmdlets. And then down on the bottom, under remarks, there are these additional parameters you can add when you use get-help to get more info. For example, if you use -examples, so same command as before, get-help, get-vm, -examples, gives you concrete examples of how to use this particular cmdlet. By the way, don't be afraid to use something like ChatGPT. ChatGPT is also pretty good at generating examples for you, but here is examples that are readily available. Now, in that Get Help page, that section I just skipped that talked about syntax looks something like this. Now, if you're an old crusty guy like me who's been around Unix and Linux and are accustomed to manual pages, you're used to reading this stuff. What this stuff is essentially trying to tell you is this cmdlet has different parameters that you can use, like -name, -location, -this, -that. So it's telling you what the parameters are. But it's also telling you something crucial, which is that certain parameters work with other parameters. You can't just willy-nilly mix any old parameter. There are parameter sets that work together. This is a parameter set. Here's a second, here's a third, here's a fourth. If you don't like reading it in text, let me introduce you to show-command. This is also for Microsoft PowerShell. Show-command pops up a graphical window. To heck with this text stuff. Let's pop up a graphical window. In the graphical window, you tell us which cmdlet you're interested in, and instead of just dumping a bunch of ugly pure text on the screen, it shows you through this nice graphical interface. Here's what the parameters are. Notice that above the parameters, there's tabs. Those tabs correspond to the different property groups. So in this case, there are 4 tabs corresponding to the 4 property parameter groups that we just saw. So you can use either if you want to go with the text-based approach or you want to go with this GUI. They both provide you the means to start exploring how to use PowerCLI and PowerShell in general in your environment. Now, we got one more snapshot being taken there, different sort of snapshot. As you can see, that takes us to the end of this presentation. There's lots more to learn about PowerCLI. I'll stick around to answer questions if you got them. We are on a bit of a tight schedule, so we're going to try to get out in the next group in, but follow me afterwards, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Please do fill out your survey, and again, enjoy VMware Explorer. Thanks. Yeah?
We use the graphic interface.